Hi everyone, today's tutorial is how to make this little felt teddy bear. Now I've been designing and creating plush teddy bears and animals for years now, and my work has always used very advanced techniques and very expensive materials and to create collectibles that have sold all over the world. Those techniques and materials certainly aren't for everybody. And what I really wanted to bring to you was a little pattern that still represented a little jointed teddy bear, still has all of the charm and it has all of the mobility that you would like to see in a little bear, but without all of those difficult techniques and certainly not the cost. So he's simply made up in felt, he's button jointed, and uses really simple sewing techniques, and because he's little, he doesn't take much to fill. So the first thing you're going to need to do is to click on the link on the item description, and you'll be able to download his pattern template pieces, and there will also be a list of materials and requirements that you'll need. So I'll get you to do that first. Now there's a couple of things I'm going to have to tell you before we really get started. First of all, with tracing out your pattern pieces, you'll see on the pattern pieces that it will tell you that you need to have your felt reinforced with a fusible interfacing, a woven fusible interfacing. When you draw up your pattern pieces, do make sure that you transfer all the little markings. Now there's quite a few different markings on this to make up this little bear, because there's all sorts of joint points on the back and the back of the head and on his little arms and legs. Now the other thing that you need to be aware of is, because we're putting matched up limbs on him, the seam allowance needs to be the same all the way through the bear, and your seam allowance is not like in dressmaking. It is a very tiny seam allowance. It is around about 3 to 4 millimeters. Now it's important that you keep that consistent, because we have our joint points already marked, and we want that his little arms sit even when you're all done. If you don't have your seam allowances the same, of course you can get some twisting and so on, and we don't want that to happen. So be very careful with transferring those markings. The other thing is, we have a really tricky sort of a connection here. It looks like it's thread button jointed through, but actually it isn't. His little arms are actually buttoned onto his body, which means you can actually take them off. I don't know why you would, but you could, and so are his little legs. So what we need to do, it'll be marked on your pattern pieces, you'll be able to see. We need to put some fusible web across the tops of the thighs, the thigh pieces, and across the tops of the little arm pieces. It's all marked there on your pattern, and I find the best way to do this is when you draw your pattern up on your sheet of interface felt, then you apply your little strips actually on the square of felt. Then it's easier, then you can pull that off and cut out your pattern pieces as usual. You can't see it there, but that's actually got a little, that section there has that little bit of fusible web there. Okay, so make sure that's done, because we're going to need that to be able to button him up. Okay, also you'll see that there's two different leg styles. This is a traditional way to make a little teddy bear's foot. Now that requires some really careful sewing, and I know that that's not for everybody. That's how I've made him up this time. I like the fact that a foot pad gives you the opportunity to give him a bit more colour. But what we're going to be doing today for the sake of time is we're going to be making the alternative, and this is the pattern piece, that one there. It's just for a little simplified little club foot. Okay, it still just looks really cute. Okay, now I'm making both available to you, and you'll certainly be able to see how to put this style together as well. I'll show you that further along. So we're going to start with our little body pieces. And you have 4 pieces like this. I'm actually going to make this little one up in blue and cream felt. Because I'm doing a little club foot, I'm not going to have the benefit of that little foot pad. So I'm going to give him a little white belly. So the front of him will be white and the rest will be blue. Now the way that we do it is that our side seams are sewn first. Normally we would sew the centre seam here inner bear first. This time we're going to do it this way because of the way we're going to joint him. So we need our 2 side pieces, each of them. Just make sure that you're matching up your marks. This mark here, the first one, that's where we start our sewing, and we're going to sew all the way down to the bottom on this side, and we're going to leave this section here open. Now, as we go further along, I'm going to be teaching you a lot of different little animals and so on, which are quite small, and we want our pieces to be very precise. It really is a benefit to do a little overcasting stitch first. That way we're not dealing with any pins when we're trying to sew on the machine, and if little pieces like this slip on the machine, which they certainly can, then your little joint marks are out and your little bear might be just a little bit twisted. So we don't want that. So while it might seem like it takes a little while to do a little overcasting stitch, it's really worth it, and I do that throughout my work no matter what size. So we'll go all the way to the end. So now we have just overcast our first little seam there. We'll do the same on both pieces. You can see that one's already done. Now I'm going to machine stitch that seam in. I use my stitch length is about a number 2. Now I always double stitch every seam. It's just something that I do. We are going to be putting a fair bit of pressure on these little limbs and parts. We're going to pack them fairly firmly with stuffing, and we don't want a seam exploding. So number 2, and sew that little seam once, and then you can flip it around and sew straight over that same sewing line again. So we'll do that now. So now we have that seam machine sewn. We're just going to turn it through. I'm just going to roll that seam out. Get a nice rounded seam. And we have our button point marks marked on our pattern on the other side. You can see them there. If you just pop a pin through, that one is your arms, and you can see your little leg one there. Pop a pin through, and you can just grab your little laundry marker, and we just want a little spot there and a little spot there. Now I've already sewn the buttons on the opposite side. You can see there. Now our buttons are around about 15 mil, and they need to be exactly that size or they won't fit on the little arms and legs. So all you're going to need to do now is using an upholstery thread, nice strong upholstery thread in your chosen colour. I've just used a baby blue just to match, and just pop, and I think that a 4-hole button is best. It's just stronger. Okay, so we're going to sew a button on here and a button on here, just like we have on this piece. We have our 2 side bodies. We're going to sew them together to create that centre seam there. So I'm just going to turn one back through because it's always right sides together. This is the easiest way to do it. It's just cut one into the other one and pin it from the underside. Now what I want you to do, the easiest way to do this is if we just take a pin and we take it straight through the centre of each seam so that we've really locked it in, and then it's quite easy just to pin all the way down. Now this time we're going to go all the way to the end. Now because we're cupping one inside the other, obviously we're going to have to ease this one up just a little as we go. So pin through, take a little bit and in. Just keep easing it as you go to match that curve, and you'll find that you'll match up beautifully at the end. And do make sure at the end that it does match up perfectly. You can do one side at a time if you like. I'm going to do the whole curve, and I'm going to overcast just as we did before that entire seam. Okay, so now we have our little body sewn together. You can see I've machined that seam all the way around. We end up with like a little V section there. We're just going to turn this body through. I find the easiest thing for pushing seams out is big old plastic knitting needle and just run it around each seam like that. And those are our front centre seams that we've just sewn. So we're going to roll those out. Next thing we're going to do is fill up this little body. Now people use all sorts of different things for stuffing tools. A lot of people use chopsticks, knitting needles, and if you're lucky enough you might be able to get yourself a pair of hemostats or forceps, which I find is the best thing for stuffing any little toy. And it's just a matter of filling up that little space. Now don't be afraid to pack that little body really firm, so just small pieces, and always support the area that you're filling, because you don't want to distort the felt, because the felt is quite mouldable still and we don't want it to be lumpy. So you keep on filling and packing quite firmly. You'll be surprised how much this little body will take. It's a little bit hard for me to show you just exactly how firm, but I'll try and give you an idea with this little one. There really isn't much give there at all. You really can pack it quite solid. You can see there that it's still quite soft. We actually need it packed quite firm. You can see that it's not giving much to any pressure there at all. So keep filling him up until we get to the top. So now we have our little body all filled, as you can see, filled right up to the top, and just a little bit softly around that neck area there. Now you can see that that's quite firm. You'd be surprised how much this little bear can eat. So this is his front. When you are filling him, make sure you have a good look at it and make sure that you're filling out his tummy evenly, and he should look like a little pear at the end. Now what we're going to do now is we're going to sew up this little neck section here, and we do that with a blanket stitch. I do have a video that shows you how to do a blanket stitch. So the best way to do that is we're going to meet the seams again. We want them, and this is where your seam allowance being kept even really comes into play. Because we've kept it all nice and even, everything matches up beautifully. We're going to go straight through that seam with your pin. That's all that's going to do, is just hold that into place there. We don't glue this seam. I know that I often do, but not with this one. So if you just hold it pinched closed there, we're going to sew that up using, I use a perlé thread. You can use something like an embroidery thread if you like. Probably 3 strands would be best. And all we're going to do is we're just going to pass it in through there, and we're going to come out right at the start of that seam where your machine stitching ended, with a nice knot on the end which won't show. Go right through the stuffing, and you're simply just going to blanket stitch all the way around. Once you get to there, make sure your seams are locked in, and you can use your little awl as you go just to tuck in your little bits of stuffing, and sew right round that top edge. There is your finished little blanket stitch seam there, and remember that we've kept even that blanket stitching to about the 3 to 4 millimetre seam allowance. That's the little body done, and we're going to pop that aside now, and we're going to make up the little arms and legs. I've already done one of each. We've just got our little arm pieces, just right sides together again. You should have transferred your marks, and so the section that we're going to sew is from this mark all the way around up to this mark, and we're going to leave this section open. So again, I recommend that you do an overcasting stitch first, and then these little pieces are very easy to manage on the machine. Same with the little club foot. You've got your 2 pieces right sides together. You're going to sew all the way around the foot and right up to here, and leave that one open. Remember that I said I like to double sew every seam. This is for the club foot. This is the alternative leg that will be in, you would have downloaded in your pattern templates. This is for the little leg that has the foot pad in it. It comes as it's like a little double, so it's folded over and that one has its little mark here, and you can see that that just gets sewn to the toe. This section is left open, and in here is where we would stitch. We'd pop in our little foot pad there. If you'd like to do this leg for your little bear, I have a tutorial called how to do a stab back stitch, and that will show you exactly how to not only sew that in but to pin it in easily, and show you how to sew that little foot pad in. It's entirely up to you. If you're feeling a little unsure, perhaps if you just make up the first one with a little club foot, and then you'll be good to go. So we're going to go ahead and sew those little legs and arm pieces together. Now we have our little arms and legs pieces all sewn up. We're going to turn them through the right way. My best advice here is they can be fairly stiff to turn through. Just manipulate it a little first, soften up the seams, and whatever you use, I use forceps just because it's easier. Start at the tip, and you really just want it to fold in on itself to be able to slip through. It does take a bit of fiddling with, and we just pop that through. Now again, I use my knitting needle to get right in there and really push that seam all the way out. Just a tip too, when you're sewing anything that you're going to fill with plush and really fill up fairly firmly, your thread colour, when in doubt, if you can't match it perfectly, always go darker rather than lighter. It will always work better and be more invisible if you're a shade darker than your base fabric. Okay, so do the same with the little leg as well. Push it all the way out so that I rolled the seams out, and then we're just going to fill up that little paw like we've done here. Again, just a little bit, support the end, and we really want to get that stuffing right down to the end. Check that you're filling it out nice and evenly, and don't be afraid to pack it in really firm. Again, you'll be surprised how much these little limbs can take with stuffing. Just pack it in there. We're only going to fill quite firmly up until that section that's open. We really want that section there to be left quite empty and flat. You can see on that little arm there's no filling in there at all. So do the same with your legs and arms, just up to that point, and then we'll take it from there. Our little arms and legs are filled, just leaving that top section quite empty. Next step is to sew those two edges together evenly from where you started and finished with a blanket stitch again. You actually do it exactly the same as you've just done it on the body, and same seam allowance. You can see that one there, and I'll use a blue perlé thread on those. We have all of our little limbs all sewn up now. Make sure that you've transferred your opening markings on all of those pieces from your pattern. Remember that we put some fusible webbing on the tops of the thighs and the tops of the arms on the inside pieces. Now is where we're going to take those, and using a protective cloth and a very hot iron, we're just going to press the top of each thigh together, which will seal it shut, and we'll do the same with the tops of the arms. That way we'll be able to cut that little opening as a buttonhole, and it will stay fused permanently together. Now we have all our upper thighs and upper arms are fused together with the fusible webbing. The best way to cut this little opening here is probably with a very sharp blade or a little scalpel. I haven't got one with me at the moment. The other alternative is just to treat it like an ordinary buttonhole. You can start by putting your little seam ripper, your quick unpick, and making your initial hole, and then you can cut with your scissors. I have given you the measurement there. Be careful to cut your little opening just inside of that, because you can always extend it. It's always worth cutting it a little bit tighter, trying it on your button, and then extending it if you need to. So we'll do that. Right, so we have our little limbs with our little, see our little buttonholes cut into them, and you can see that I've already buttoned on. It's just a simple matter of popping his arms and legs on with a button. It's better if it's a little bit tight, because the felt does tend to stretch, and you'll probably never take his arms and legs off. Well, I hope you don't anyway. Okay, there we go. So we've got a little headless bear friend there for him. So he needs a head, so we'll get going on that now. We have our two face pieces. You can see that I have already heat pressed on the little muzzle section, the two little ears, and the black nose there. I've gone ahead and done an applique stitch around each of those pieces, not on the nose. There's a couple of options here. If you don't want to do that kind of intense stitching there, you could just do a simple running stitch around it and make it more of a primitive look. If you want to just leave it ironed on with no stitching around the edge, that's fine as well. I would recommend though that instead of using felt for those three pieces, that you try and get yourself some little scraps perhaps of lycra, because that's what I've used for the nose here. And you find that lycra is quite amazing in that the adhesion is just so good and the line's so clear that you don't need to do anything more to it. It would really be worth buying yourself just a little bit of black lycra, just so you can do your animal noses like that. So I've done that. I've also drawn in his little smile, which is there on your pattern piece, and I've drawn that in, and the way that we do that is just with two strands of embroidery thread, and with knot the end and come in from behind right on that first little mark there. And come out, it's actually just a little stab stitch. It's a stab back stitch, which is actually completely linked. Make sure that your little stitches are nice and small. So we go through, then we're going to come back out on our line. Keep your stitches the same length, right on the line there. And then we're going to link it up by going straight back into that hole that we just came from. And that way you get a perfectly linked line right to the end. So now he has his little embroidered smile, and we're going to sew those two head pieces together. Again, just check your marks that you would have transferred onto your fabric, and you can see that there's one there and there's one there. And we're going to do an overcast stitch all the way around and then machine sew twice, just as you have with all of your other parts. Those are our little face pieces sewn together, machine sewn twice from there to there. We've left the top section open. Just going to turn that one through. Here's my knitting needle again. Get those seams right out. Roll those seams. You can see we've got that little face there. It'll look lovely. Our next step is to fill that little face. We're not going to fill this part quite so firmly as our limbs and our body. It's still fairly firm, but because we're going to close these ears off flat, a little bit like we did the tops of the arms and the legs, we can only fill it so much, but we need enough volume in there that when we put the little eyes in, we can pull it in and do a little bit of needle sculpting there. So we'll fill that up just to about here. So I have this little head filled, just enough to be able to close across the top here. Probably the easiest way to do this is to glue I just glue one ear at a time and give it a little bit of time to hold. We're going to blanket stitch that whole top line, but if we just glue one little ear at a time and give it just a little bit of time to set, and we glue the second one once that one's dry, and then we can tuck that last little bit of stuffing in and glue across that top line. I often find that a little alligator clamp like that is useful because you can always pop it on there and pop it on the other ear and even across the top of the head, which is usually how I do that part there. You can see that I just clamp it while it's glued, and then I just let that sit there for a while. So glue that top edge, and then we'll get it ready for stitching. So our little top edge here is all glued and dried, and now we just sew a blanket stitch from that ear right round to that one, just as you did on the top of the arms and the legs. So Teddy's ears are now sewn in nicely and his head is all closed. I've marked in his little eye positions. We're going to be pulling them in with a little bit of needle sculpting, so you have to remember that where they appear to be there is not where they will actually be, because they'll be pulled in, so they'll sink in, they'll end up closer. I have the eye placement marked on your pattern piece, but I do ask you to check, because your sewing might be slightly different from mine. Best always to measure it, and the best way to measure it is right from the centre of his nose, and make sure that they are the same distance apart from the centre of the nose, and make sure that they're not sitting up too high, but use my template as a guide. Now I've chosen some really tiny little buttons. They're not specialty buttons. I just found them in our local craft shop and they're really good. Whenever I find tiny ones like this, I always buy a heap. So, and I'm just using black, because black or very, very dark brown just seems to work best. Colours tend to look a little bit starey. So we're going to start by using an extra strong upholstery thread on a needle, just a single strand, just a nice neat knot on the end. We're going to start at the front so we can get that placement really good. We're going to start straight through the centre of the eye. Have a look as you're going through. We want to keep that coming out quite parallel there, right through to the back of the head. Then we're actually going to try and go back in the same hole or very close to the same hole. We're going to come out again right on the same spot just about, and we're going to put our first little button on. Make sure that's the right way. And come all the way through. Now it takes a little bit of holding to get it in the right position here. We just let it sit there, and we're going to put our needle, if you can see, right in close there again. We're going to come out, if we can, again in the same general area and pull that right through. Make sure that our little threads aren't twisted. And you can see that that's going to cover that little knot. Now at the moment it's just sitting on top, and you can see that that's a little bit starey. What we want to do is pull that right in, and it really gives them a nice expression. So you pull it right in. Because it's upholstery thread, it'll be fine. Just hold that there. Again, we're going to go back in close as we can to that same hole. And we're just going to continue. Sometimes it can take a little bit of finding where those little holes are. There we go. And as you go back and forth, just keep squeezing in. Now that's our first eye. I've probably passed back and forth through there about 5 to 6 times. Just make sure you keep squeezing as you go. Then you can see that that's actually quite locked in there. Rather than rethreading your needle, because you've got a fair bit of thread there, we've come out there at the back. I just travel across and come out across to where the back of the other eye is going to be. And then we can go straight through and come out right on that eye spot. And then we do exactly the same thing for the second eye. And the important thing here is to make sure that you are needle sculpting that second eye in to match the first. So we don't want him sitting there with one eye sitting right out and one eye pulled right in. We want them to be nice and even. So check your placement. Make sure you're pulling it into the right spot so that when you put your next stitches in, and sew that in nice and tight just the same. And then you'll end up with a nice even pair. That's our second eye now pulled in nice and evenly. You can see that there. I'm just going to show you when we finish off in anything that's 3D or plush, dive back into the little head and just come out a little way away. We don't actually tie off a knot because we really don't want that showing. So the trick is to go in and out, travelling back in through the same hole each time, and you work a sort of a crisscross pattern that's going to hold your thread. If you come out on a seam at the end, you're really going to anchor that in, and it's just a matter of snipping that thread, pulling on it and snipping that thread, and your thread end will pop back in to your little head and you won't see any of those nasty knots at the back. There we go, his little head finished. Now we just need to show you how to pop that on. To join this little bear's head to his body, we're going to need 2 buttons the same size. Just colour coordinate them to your bear. They have to be about 2 centimetres in diameter. Right, I'm going to show you the way that this is done. What we're going to do, we usually use ideally I would use a 2 button hole because we're only going to use 2 of those holes. I just don't at the moment have any of those. This is how we'll do it. There will be the little bear's head, 1 button will be joined onto here, and there'll be another button here, and it will be threaded through. Now I'm going to thread it through, and then I'm going to show you how that layout works. So what you can see here, I have my points marked on the back of my little bear's head. I have my points marked here. You'll find all of those marks on your pattern pieces. And I have started on one side and entered with my needle. Now I'm using an extra strong upholstery thread, double stranded. So I've started, gone in 1 hole, entered through that mark, come through, entered through my centre button, inside the little bear's head, dived in, come across, come out, and taken the same route back. So what we've got is a little joint there. And all we have to do now, you can see, we've got our 2 ends, and somebody else's hands here is really useful because you want somebody to hold that knot, because what we want to do is tie that knot in over that button while we're squeezing the little parts together like that, and we're going to tie that off like you can see we've done here. We've actually tied it off, and then I'll show you how to hide the little thread ends. So let me just tie that off. Right, so little bear's head is on. Let's just check that it's all in the right position. I've tied off probably about 4 times there, and I've rethreaded one of my ends onto my needle. This is just so that we don't cut the thread ends. I'm going to just dive back into that hole and just come out anywhere on the front of your bear. Sink those thread ends in, and I would actually go back into that hole and just back through the back. Snip that end, then just do exactly the same thing with your second one. Rethread that onto your needle and dive it back in. Yay, so now is all done and little brown bear has got a blue friend. So he looks great. Now I hope you've really enjoyed this tutorial. I'm going to be designing a few more patterns using this same technique, particularly with the head joint. I've got a little Westie here, a little coat, and we'll be doing a few little dog breeds like that. Still very simple. So remember, if you've enjoyed the tutorial, remember to subscribe and come and visit me on my blog at lisapay.com, and we'll see you next time.